Rob, are the reforms that you saw or heard him talk about going to make a difference?
I don't know. I mean, like everything else, remember that, Obama and Biden put out their plan for how law enforcement should be reformed. And essentially now Trump's done the same thing. The question is, will the law enforcement community adopt these essentially suggestions? Remember that there is
That's
no
right.
law here. There's no mandate. There's no federal policing. There's no federal policing standards. So what's interesting here is there what I believe the president could do, obviously working with the Attorney General and the Department of Justice, is say federal police, the FBI, the ATF, everybody involved, Homeland Security, the largest police department in the country is Department of Homeland Security. He could have said, here's what we are doing, period. We are changing policy at the executive branch in the way that we can, the Trump administration, and we're going to try to set an example for local law enforcement. But he didn't do that. He did put forth a couple of things that I think are really interesting and worth talking about. One of them is the funding for what they're calling co-responders. That's become a term that we never heard, in the except for the last 10 days. It's someone who goes with the first responder to handle, I guess, the softer sides of intervention from the mental health professionals that will accompany law enforcement, not go instead of law enforcement, but apparently accompany law enforcement to maybe domestic violence, issues with a mentally disturbed or emotionally disturbed persons, issues of homelessness. I think that's a good step. I think that's great. One of the things that's a little bit ham-fisted is this idea of chokeholds, right? So chokeholds aren't allowed except when they're allowed, and that's going to be determined by the officer's perception. Well, guess what? That's exactly what we have now. There's no one's been using chokeholds except in situations where the officer was trying to control someone who they were defending themselves from. So this idea that you can only use a chokehold when an officer perceives that their life is being threatened. The problem you have to remember, and this is exactly the issue in Atlanta with this Wendy's shooting, is that any significant damage to a police officer is always going to be, in the current paradigm, it's always going to be articulated as potentially life-threatening, because the storyline goes, this guy in the Wendy's parking lot had a taser. He could have incapacitated an officer, taken the officer's handgun, and then killed the officer or killed others. So there's always this exigent circumstance that if you follow the path of violence used against officers, that it could lead to that officer being killed or some other people being killed because the officer's gun could then be taken from an incapacitated officer. So it's a pretty big loophole. It's a big asterisk on the chokeholds aren't allowed. The other thing we have to remember, and this goes back to the 90s, is it's really hard to define chokeholds being allowed. For example, in our training to law enforcement for years, decades now almost, we've advocated for what we refer to as a counter ambush policy. And what that means is in your book of policies, it says officers are allowed to do things that are untrained but justified under the circumstances. So even if you take out the training of chokeholds, whatever you're going to define as a chokehold, whether it's an airway block or a blood block to the brain, if you're going to take those out of the training completely and take those out of explicitly authorized techniques, any department worth their salt is going to have a counter ambush policy that specifically keeps officers from having to go up on the stand and somebody saying to them, a lawyer, it's going to have a shifty lawyer saying, well, is what you did something you were trained to do in the academy? Well, then was it authorized by your department's policies? And the officers are able to say in good faith, yes, under these circumstances, what I did was justified and it's covered by our counter ambush policy. So I don't really think anything. I mean, if magically that executive order were put into place at every law enforcement agency in the country, it really does nothing to change the chokehold issue. It doesn't address the chokehold issue. The last piece of the puzzle in the executive orders that I think is worth talking about is this idea that there's going to be some kind of national database created in regard to officers who have, I guess, complaints or maybe who have been sanctioned or punished inside of their agencies over use of force issues. That's a little bit sketchy. I'm not exactly sure what that means. As long as you have full qualified immunity like we do today, as long as you have the police unions like we do today, you have right to privacy issues that are going to come into play with that. I don't really know what that is or how that works. It's an interesting idea. Unfortunately, I think it plays a little bit too much this idea that there's like four bad police officers who just keep jumping from one agency to another. That's sort of the narrative behind that idea, so that a police department's supposed to be able to look up and see, oh, Bill Smith, well, you had a problem with use of force at the old agency you were with, so now we're not going to hire you. I don't really know that that's worth a federal database kind of situation. That really comes down to law enforcement officers policing our own, and police departments being honest about why officers are fired, not letting officers resign or move on for reasons other than, hey, I don't want to be a police officer. When I decided in 2001 that I wanted to teach full time, I let the police department know, and I resigned. It's called resigned in good standing. The whole idea that we have the phrase resigned in good standing suggests that there are other people who are resigning for other reasons, right? And that's really what we need to stop. If somebody needs to be fired, fire them.
Right.
Put that black mark on their resume, and let's move on with life. Let's stop trying to protect ourselves from getting sued for firing somebody who needed to be fired. Let's just go ahead and bite that bullet and fight that out. I think a police department that's worried about the liability of keeping an officer on the department should also accept the liability of firing that officer.
Yeah, I haven't read the entire document yet, and I'm not going to comment any further.